I pulled my truck up to the lodge just as the last traces of daylight faded behind the mountain ridges. The headlights swept across the familiar gravel parking area, catching the weathered wooden sign that marked this place as Pine Ridge Research Station, though nobody ever explained what exactly we were researching out here. The engine ticked as it cooled, the only sound besides the wind starting to move through the towering pines that surrounded us on all sides. 3 months I'd been making this drive up the winding dirt road, and I still felt that same mix of anticipation and wariness each time I saw the lodge emerge from the forest. The building looked like something from an old postcard, all dark wood and stone chimneys, restored to capture that 1950s mountain retreat aesthetic. Someone had put serious money into making it perfect, down to the original fixtures and hand-carved railings. But the isolation was what struck you first. No cell towers, no other buildings, just miles of wilderness stretching in every direction until you hit the nearest town. I grabbed my thermos and overnight bag from the passenger seat, checking my watch as I walked toward the main entrance. 6:30 on the dot. Corey would be finishing his day shift paperwork, probably eager to head back down the mountain before full darkness set in. The day crew always seemed relieved when evening arrived, like they'd made it through something difficult, even though the real challenges didn't start until after sunset. The heavy front door opened with its usual groan, and I stepped into the warmth of the main hallway. Everything smelled like pine polish and old wood, that comfortable lodge scent that reminded me of my grandmother's cabin back in eastern Kentucky. She would have understood this place better than most, the way it felt alive after dark, how certain corners seemed to watch you, the importance of following rules that didn't make sense to outsiders. "Chris," Corey's voice carried from the office down the hall. Perfect timing, just finished the daily reports. My best friend appeared in the doorway, already wearing his jacket and looking ready to leave. We'd known each other since high school, and when this opportunity came up 3 months ago, I'd convinced him to apply with me. The pay was too good to pass up, more than either of us had ever made, with housing and meals included. The job posting had been vague about duties, just mentioning facility maintenance and overnight monitoring. But they'd seemed particularly interested in my background growing up in Appalachian coal country. "Anything unusual today?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Daytime was always quiet. Whatever lived in these mountains respected certain boundaries, and sunlight was apparently one of them. "Nope. Tom and Marie are already here getting set up in the equipment room." Corey pulled on his gloves, glancing toward the windows where darkness was settling between the trees. "Radio's been quiet. Weather looks stable. Should be a routine night." We both knew there was no such thing as routine here, but we'd learned to maintain the fiction during shift changes. It helped with the transition, keeping things normal for a few more minutes before the real work began. Corey headed for the door, then paused. "Oh, new rules are up. 4 of them tonight." My stomach tightened slightly. Rules were how we survived here. They appeared every evening on the dining room bulletin board, written in that same neat handwriting none of us had ever seen produced. Sometimes there were 2, sometimes 6, but they were always specific and always non-negotiable. The previous night's rules would be gone, replaced by fresh instructions tailored to whatever entities were active. I heard Corey's truck start up outside as I made my way to the dining room. The space was beautiful in that rustic, expensive way. Hand-hewn beams, a massive stone fireplace, windows that during the day offered incredible mountain views. Now those windows reflected only our interior lights against the growing darkness beyond. The bulletin board hung beside the kitchen entrance, and I approached it with the same careful attention I'd learned to pay to everything here. 4 index cards were pinned in a neat row, each containing a single rule written in blue ink. Do not respond to crying baby sounds. Go to the dining room immediately if window tapping occurs. Close all doors quietly between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. Never look back if footsteps follow you. I read through them twice, committing each word to memory. The crying baby was new. We'd never had that one before. Window tapping was familiar from 2 weeks ago, though the response had been different then. The door rule was common enough, usually showing up when something was particularly active in the hallways. But the footsteps warning made my skin crawl. That suggested something that would hunt, something that wanted to be acknowledged. My grandmother had told me stories about things in the mountains that mimicked human sounds, trying to lure people into the woods or trick them into breaking protective boundaries. She'd called them the old things that never left, spirits that remembered when humans were rare visitors instead of neighbors. Most people dismissed those stories as folklore, but growing up in coal country, you learned that some folklore existed for good reasons. I took a photo of the rules with my phone, though the device would be useless for communication until the helicopter returned. We were truly cut off up here. No internet, no cell service, just radio contact with the outside world. The isolation was intentional, part of whatever research this place was really conducting. They'd made that clear during our hiring interviews, though they'd been vague about everything else. Tom emerged from the kitchen carrying a fresh pot of coffee and moving with that alert, careful way he'd developed since starting here. He was a few years older than Corey and me, with light brown hair and the kind of lean build that came from outdoor work. His eyes were always moving, always checking corners and shadows. "Saw the rules," he said, setting the coffee pot on the serving station. "4 tonight. That usually means it's going to be active." Marie appeared from the equipment room, her auburn hair pulled back in its usual ponytail. She had the kind of steady presence that made her invaluable during difficult nights. Never panicking, but never dismissing dangers either. All 4 of us had learned to trust each other's instincts completely. It was the only way to survive here. "Radio check?" she asked, and I pulled mine from my belt. "Lodge base. This is Wilson." I spoke into the device. "Wilson, this is Lodge base. Clear signal, weather holding steady. Helicopter arrival scheduled for 5 days from now, weather permitting." 5 days. That meant we were committed to whatever the next few nights brought. The helicopter was our only connection to the outside world, bringing supplies and personnel changes on an irregular schedule that seemed to depend on factors beyond simple logistics. Sometimes it came early, sometimes late, but never when we expected trouble. I clipped the radio back to my belt and picked up my clipboard for the evening rounds. The checklist was straightforward. Verify all exterior doors were locked, check window latches, confirm emergency equipment was functional, test communications gear. Basic security measures that took on deeper meaning when you understood what we were securing against. "Starting perimeter sweep," I announced to the room. Tom nodded from his position near the coffee station. "We'll be monitoring from here. Radio if anything feels off." The hallway stretched away from the dining room in 3 directions, leading to guest rooms that never hosted guests, a library stocked with books on regional folklore, and administrative offices that seemed too elaborate for a simple research station. Everything was maintained perfectly despite the absence of visitors, as if the building itself was the real purpose rather than whatever activities supposedly took place inside it. I began my walk through the main corridor, checking door handles and window locks with practiced efficiency. Each room had been decorated with period-appropriate furniture and fixtures, creating the illusion of a functioning lodge from decades past. But there were modern additions hidden in plain sight: motion sensors in corners, electromagnetic field detectors disguised as decoration, and recording equipment built into the walls. The wind outside was picking up, pressing against the windows and creating small sounds that required constant evaluation. Was that branch movement? Or something else? Natural settling? Or purposeful contact? We'd all learned to distinguish between normal mountain sounds and signs of supernatural activity, though the process had taken weeks of careful observation and more than a few close calls. I finished the interior sweep and approached the main entrance for the exterior check. The heavy door opened easily, revealing the parking area where my truck sat beside the lodge vehicles. Beyond the gravel, darkness had claimed the forest completely. No moon tonight, just the faint starlight filtered through pine branches and the warm glow spilling from the lodge windows. The wind carried the scent of pine needles and mountain earth, familiar smells that reminded me why I'd been drawn to this work despite its obvious dangers. These mountains felt alive in ways that city people couldn't understand, connected to something older and deeper than human civilization. My grandmother had taught me to respect that presence, to acknowledge forces that existed beyond our comprehension. I completed my circuit around the building, checking each ground floor window and door, noting the positions of the motion-activated lights that would help us track movement during the night. Everything appeared secure, but I knew that meant little here. The entities that visited this place weren't stopped by locks or deterred by lights. They followed different rules, older agreements that we were still learning to navigate. The back porch offered a view of the forest that stretched unbroken to the horizon, mile after mile of wilderness that had remained virtually unchanged for centuries. During the day, it was beautiful. At night, it became something else entirely, a vast space where things moved according to their own purposes, occasionally venturing close enough to test our boundaries. I stepped back inside and secured the door, checking the locks twice before heading back toward the dining room. The first hour of the shift was always the quietest, a grace period before the real activity began. We used that time to review procedures, check equipment, and mentally prepare for whatever the night might bring. Tom and Marie looked up as I entered the dining room, both of them already settled at the main table with their radios and monitoring equipment spread between them. The coffee smelled strong and dark, the kind that would help us stay alert through the long hours ahead. "Perimeter secure," I reported, settling into my usual chair with a view of both the main entrance and the kitchen. "Wind's picking up, but everything looks normal." Normal. We used that word carefully here, knowing it meant something different than it did in the outside world. Normal meant following rules, respecting boundaries, and trusting that our careful protocols would see us through another night in this strange, isolated place where old things still held power and demanded acknowledgement. The mountain wind pressed against the windows as I opened my thermos and began the long watch toward dawn. The radio crackled against my belt as I stepped back outside for my second perimeter check of the night. 2 hours in, and the temperature had dropped enough that I could see my breath in small puffs. I pulled my jacket tighter and clicked the radio twice to signal Tom and Marie that I was beginning another circuit. The lodge felt different now, settled into its nighttime rhythm. During those first weeks here, I'd thought the building itself changed after dark, but now I understood it was everything else that transformed. The forest pressed closer somehow. The shadows between the trees became deeper, and sounds carried differently through the mountain air. My grandmother would have called it the veil thinning, that time when the old things felt bold enough to venture near human spaces. I started my walk along the lodge's east side, checking window latches and scanning the tree line with my flashlight beam. The motion sensors remained inactive, their small red lights blinking steadily in the darkness. Everything looked normal, which meant absolutely nothing here. Normal was just the calm before something tested our boundaries. The baby's cry cut through the silence like a blade. My whole body froze. The sound came from somewhere deep in the trees, high and desperate and completely heart-wrenching. Every instinct I'd ever developed, every protective urge that made me human, screamed at me to move toward that sound. Some infant was out there in the cold darkness, terrified and alone. My hand was already reaching for the high-powered flashlight clipped to my belt before my brain caught up. The first rule: do not respond to crying baby sounds. I forced my fingers away from the light and kept walking, though every step felt like I was abandoning someone who needed help. The crying got louder, more desperate. It seemed to move through the trees, coming from the north, then the east, then directly ahead of me. That was impossible unless someone was carrying a baby through the forest at night, which made no sense. But the sound was so real. so convincing. I could hear the exhausted gasps between wails, the way a real infant's cry broke and reformed. I rounded the corner to the lodge's south face, and the crying followed me. It was closer now, maybe 30 yards into the tree line. The rational part of my mind noted that the sound moved too quickly, covered too much ground, but the emotional part was still fighting to turn around and help. My grandmother's voice echoed in my memory, telling me about the things that lived deep in the Kentucky mountains. "They know what sounds pull at human hearts," she'd said, sitting on her porch while fireflies blinked in the hollows below. A baby crying, a woman screaming, an old man calling for help. They use our kindness against us, Chris. The old things remember when humans first came to the mountains, and they learned our weaknesses. The crying intensified as I checked the windows along the south wall. Each latch was secure, each motion sensor functional, but I could barely focus on my tasks. The sound was so close now that it felt like the baby had to be just beyond the tree line, maybe injured, definitely cold and scared. I completed the south wall and turned toward the lodge's backside. The crying stopped abruptly, leaving only the natural sounds of wind through pine branches. For a moment, relief flooded through me. Maybe it had been a real animal, something that had moved on to hunt elsewhere. Then the toddler started calling, "Help me! Please help me!" The voice was small and frightened, coming from the same area where the baby had been crying. A little child, old enough to form words, but young enough to sound completely vulnerable. My step faltered as every parental instinct I didn't even know I had fired at once. "I'm lost. I can't find my mommy." I kept walking, checking the back porch locks with hands that trembled slightly. The voice was so clear, so specific. This wasn't some generic crying anymore. This was a specific child with specific fears, begging for help that I could provide if I just turned on my flashlight and walked into the trees. But my grandmother's stories held me in place. She'd told me about her neighbor who'd heard a child calling from the woods behind his house, how he'd searched all night with a lantern and never came home. They'd found his body weeks later, miles deeper in the mountains than anyone could have walked in a single night, like something had led him in circles until he collapsed from exhaustion. "Please, I'm scared. The dark is scary." The voice was moving again, tracking my progress around the building. Whatever was making these sounds was intelligent enough to follow my route, to position itself where the cries would seem most immediate and urgent. That level of calculation made this worse somehow, more predatory. I forced myself to keep checking windows and doors, maintaining my routine, even as the voice shifted tactics again. Now it was calling my name. "Chris! Chris, help me! I know you can hear me!" My blood went cold. This thing knew my name. It had been watching us, learning about us, gathering information to make its deception more effective. The voice still sounded like a frightened child, but now it carried knowledge no lost toddler should possess. "Chris, my mommy said you would help. She said you're nice." I reached the lodge's front corner and stopped. The voice was coming from directly ahead now, somewhere near the parking area. If I looked, I might see something that appeared to be a small child standing at the edge of the gravel just beyond the reach of the porch lights. The temptation to shine my flashlight in that direction was almost overwhelming. Instead, I focused on my grandmother's teachings about these encounters. "Don't look for them," she'd said. "Don't acknowledge them. The old things feed on attention, on recognition. Act like they don't exist, and they'll move on to easier prey." The child's voice was getting more sophisticated, more manipulative. "I see you, Chris. I see you walking around. Why won't you help me? Are you mean? My mommy said you were nice, but you're not helping." Now it was trying guilt, trying to make me feel responsible for its distress. I completed my circuit of the building and headed for the main entrance, each step feeling like I was walking away from genuine suffering. The logical part of my mind knew this was a test, a supernatural entity following the patterns my grandmother had described. But the emotional part was still torn apart by those desperate cries. "Chris, don't leave me. Please don't leave me alone." I reached the front door and pulled it open, the warm air from inside the lodge hitting my face like a physical relief. The voice behind me crescendoed into pure desperation. "Chris! Mommy said you would help! Chris!" I stepped inside and closed the door firmly behind me, engaging both locks and leaning against the solid wood for a moment. My hands were shaking slightly, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. The encounter had lasted maybe 10 minutes, but it felt like hours of psychological pressure. Through the front windows, I could still hear the voice calling my name, but it was already growing fainter. Whatever was out there had recognized that its strategy wasn't working, that I wasn't going to break the rules and venture into the forest. The intelligence behind the deception was moving on, probably to test other vulnerabilities or wait for a better opportunity. I walked back toward the dining room, my radio crackling as Tom's voice came through. "Chris, you good out there? Thought I heard something." "All clear," I replied, though my voice sounded rougher than usual. "Just finishing perimeter check." The calling stopped completely as I reached the dining room, where Tom and Marie looked up from their monitoring equipment. The warm lights and familiar faces helped ground me back in the safe space we'd created here. Outside, the forest had returned to its normal sounds. Wind through branches, the distant call of an owl, small creatures moving through the underbrush. "First rule?" Tom asked quietly, and I nodded. "Crying baby," then a lost child calling my name. Lasted about 20 minutes total. Marie made a note on her clipboard. We'd learned to document these encounters, building a record of the entity's behavior patterns and tactics. The information might help us survive future tests, or at least understand what we were dealing with. I poured myself coffee and settled into my chair, still feeling the echo of that desperate voice calling my name. The entity had been convincing, sophisticated in its emotional manipulation. If I hadn't grown up with my grandmother's stories, if I hadn't learned to recognize the signs of supernatural deception, I might have walked into those trees with my flashlight and never walked back out. The mountain wind pressed against the windows as I sipped my coffee, and I felt a familiar sense of accomplishment. The night was still young, and there would likely be other tests before dawn, but I'd passed the first one. The rules had held. My grandmother's teachings had held. I'd learned to survive in this strange place where old things still held power, and tonight, that knowledge had kept me alive. I pushed back from the table, my coffee only half finished. The encounter outside had left me jittery, and sitting still felt impossible. My hands needed something to do, some routine task to ground me back in normalcy. "Need to grab something from the kitchen," I told Tom and Marie, who looked up from their monitoring equipment. The main hallway stretched ahead of me, dimly lit by the vintage fixtures that cast pools of warm light between longer stretches of shadow. My boots made soft sounds against the hardwood floor as I walked, a steady rhythm that helped calm my nerves. The lodge felt settled around me, that familiar nighttime quiet where every small noise seemed amplified. That's when I heard them. Footsteps behind me, matching my pace exactly. I stopped walking. The footsteps stopped too, like an echo that arrived a split second too late. My skin prickled as I stood motionless in the hallway, listening to the silence that felt too complete, too deliberate. The grandfather clock in the main room ticked steadily, but underneath that normal sound was something else. A presence waiting, watching. I started walking again, and the footsteps resumed. Not echoes this time, but deliberate sounds that followed my rhythm while remaining distinctly separate. Someone, or something, was walking behind me down the hallway, stepping in time with my movement like a shadow learning to mimic human motion. The fourth rule crashed into my consciousness with crystal clarity. Never look back. If footsteps follow you, My muscles went rigid as an overwhelming urge built in my chest, a compulsion so strong it felt like physical pressure against my lungs. Every instinct I'd ever developed screamed at me to turn around, to see what was behind me, to confront whatever was stalking me down this familiar hallway. The need was so intense it made my teeth ache. The footsteps grew closer. Each sound was crisp and deliberate, no longer matching my pace but drawing nearer with each step. Whatever walked behind me was gaining ground, approaching with the patience of something that knew I was trapped by my own curiosity. I could feel it now, a presence directly behind me, so close that the air seemed to thicken. My neck tingled with the sensation of being watched, of something studying the back of my head with predatory interest. The temperature dropped enough that I could see my breath in small puffs, though the lodge's heating system had been working perfectly all evening. Something whispered my name. The sound was barely audible, a soft exhalation that could have been wind through the walls or the building settling on its foundation. But I knew better. The whisper carried weight, intention, a deliberate attempt to make me acknowledge what walked behind me. Chris, clearer this time, unmistakably my name spoken in a voice I didn't recognize. Not male or female, not young or old, but something that existed between human categories. The whisper seemed to come from directly behind my left ear, so close that I imagined feeling breath against my skin. My vision started to blur around the edges. The hallway ahead grew dim, even though the light fixtures remained unchanged, as if darkness was seeping into my peripheral vision from behind. The dining room seemed impossibly far away now, though I'd only walked 20 feet from where I'd started. The whispers became more insistent, overlapping now like multiple voices speaking my name in perfect unison. They wrapped around me like a fog, making it hard to think clearly about anything except the overwhelming need to turn around and see what wanted my attention so desperately. Chris, Chris, Chris. My head began to turn against my will, muscles moving without my permission as the entity's influence pressed against my mind, like water finding cracks in stone. I could feel my grandmother's teachings fighting against the supernatural pressure, but the pull was stronger than anything I'd experienced before. This wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was compulsion, mental domination that bypassed conscious thought. The darkness crept further into my vision, turning the hallway into a tunnel with the dining room as a distant point of light. My neck muscles strained as my head continued its slow rotation, millimeter by millimeter, toward whatever waited behind me with infinite patience. I was going to look. I was going to break the rule and see something that would probably destroy me, and I couldn't stop it from happening. Tom Anderson appeared from the side corridor like he'd materialized from the shadows themselves. His hand clamped around my arm with enough force to cut through the supernatural fog that had been clouding my thoughts. The touch was solid, real, human, everything the whispers weren't. The darkness receded from my vision like someone had turned up the lights, and suddenly I could think clearly again. Tom didn't speak. He just guided me forward with firm pressure, his grip on my arm steering me toward the dining room with quick, purposeful steps. I could feel him breathing hard, tension radiating from his body like he'd been running. Behind us, the footsteps continued for another few seconds before fading into the general sounds of the lodge settling around its foundations. We reached the dining room, and the overhead lights seemed to push back the darkness that had been creeping into my peripheral vision. The familiar space felt like sanctuary, with its warm wood paneling and the comfortable presence of Marie still monitoring her equipment at the table. The supernatural pressure that had been building around me dissolved completely, leaving only the normal atmosphere of our nighttime routine. Tom released my arm and sank into a chair, running his hands through his light brown hair. Both of us were breathing harder than the short walk should have required, like we'd just finished a sprint instead of a casual stroll down the hallway. Marie looked up from her radio, concern clear in her green eyes. "Everything okay?" I nodded, though my hands were still trembling slightly as I poured fresh coffee. The fourth rule had nearly claimed me, and if Tom hadn't appeared exactly when he did, I would have turned around to see whatever entity had been stalking me through the lodge's main corridor. The thought of what might have happened then made my stomach twist. Just a quick walk, I managed, settling into my usual chair. The dining room felt safer now, brighter, like the overhead lights created a barrier that the hallway's shadows couldn't cross. Tom met my eyes across the table, and I saw understanding there. He knew what had just happened, knew how close I'd come to breaking one of the fundamental rules that kept us alive in this place. The whispers had been hypnotic, almost irresistible, and without his intervention, the night might have ended very differently. The mountain wind pressed against the windows as I wrapped my hands around my coffee mug, grateful for the warmth and the solid presence of my colleagues. The entity had tested the fourth rule with sophisticated psychological pressure, but the rule had held. More importantly, our teamwork had held. We still had hours until dawn, but I felt safer now in the dining room's bright sanctuary, surrounded by people who understood the dangers we faced and the importance of watching out for each other. Tom slumped into the dining room chair across from me, his breathing still uneven from whatever had driven him to find me in that hallway. He ran both hands through his light brown hair, leaving it disheveled, and when he looked up at me, I saw something raw in his expression. Not fear exactly, but the kind of exhaustion that came from fighting invisible battles. "I heard it too," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight I hadn't expected. "The baby crying." Marie glanced up from her monitoring equipment, her green eyes shifting between us with growing concern. I set my coffee mug down, realizing that Tom's appearance in the hallway hadn't been coincidence. He'd been dealing with his own supernatural encounter, fighting his own set of compulsions while I'd been struggling with the footsteps entity. "I was in the basement checking the generator when it started," Tom continued, rubbing his palms against his knees like he was trying to warm them. "Must have been around the same time you were doing your perimeter check. That crying. God, it sounded so real. So desperate." I nodded, remembering how the sound had pulled at every protective instinct I possessed. Tom leaned back in his chair, but there was no relaxation in his posture. His shoulders remained tight, his jaw clenched like he was still fighting something. "I nearly went outside before I caught myself," he admitted. "Had my hand on the basement door, ready to walk right out into those trees. Something about being underground made it worse, like the sound was coming through the walls themselves. That's when it hit me. Tom had been missing for over an hour. I'd assumed he was somewhere in the lodge handling routine maintenance, but he'd been in the basement fighting the same entity that had tested me outside. While I'd been walking my circuit, he'd been trapped in the lower level with supernatural pressure building around him. "How long were you down there?" I asked. Tom checked his watch and winced. "Hour and a half, maybe more. Lost track of time." He looked at Marie, then back at me. "That's not the worst part, though. When I finally came back upstairs, I kept getting this urge to open my bedroom window. Could hear tapping that never came, but I wanted to unlatch it anyway. Just stand there and wait for whatever wanted in." Marie made another note on her clipboard, but I could see her hands weren't entirely steady. The second rule had been about window tapping, about going to the dining room immediately if it occurred. But Tom had experienced something more subtle, the urge to create an opening before the tapping even started. "These things," Tom continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "they're coordinated. They're not just random encounters or isolated tests. They're testing all of us at once, trying to find weaknesses in our defenses." The realization settled over me like cold water. I'd been thinking about the encounters as individual challenges, personal tests of my ability to follow the rules and resist supernatural influence. But Tom was right. The entities weren't working alone. They were part of something larger, more organized, more intelligent than I'd given them credit for. The crying baby had pulled Tom toward the basement exit at the same time it had tested me during my perimeter check. The footsteps entity had stalked me in the hallway while Tom was fighting urges to open windows upstairs. These weren't coincidences. They were coordinated attacks, probing our team for vulnerabilities while we were separated and distracted. "You saved me back there," I said, meeting Tom's eyes across the table. "If you hadn't shown up when you did," he nodded grimly. "I felt it when you didn't come back. Not sure how to explain it, but something was wrong. The lodge felt different, heavier, like something was feeding on the darkness in that hallway." Understanding washed over me in waves. Surviving these nights required more than individual rule following and personal discipline. It needed teamwork, mutual awareness, constant communication between the four of us. Tom had saved me not just by appearing at the right moment, but by being alert enough to notice my absence and track me down before the entity could finish whatever it had planned. "We should stick together more," Marie said, looking up from her equipment. "Not necessarily in the same room, but closer. More check-ins." Tom agreed immediately. The isolation is part of their strategy. They want us spread out, vulnerable, dealing with these encounters alone where fear and confusion can take hold. I poured myself fresh coffee, my hands steadier now that the full picture was becoming clear. The entities weren't just testing our rule-following abilities. They were studying our team dynamics, looking for cracks in our unity, moments when separation could be exploited. The remaining hours until dawn took on a different quality after that conversation. Instead of returning to our individual tasks and separate areas of the lodge, we stayed in the dining room together. We took turns keeping watch at the windows, monitoring the radio equipment, and maintaining awareness of our surroundings. But we did it as a unit. Tom told us about other encounters he'd experienced during previous shifts, moments when he'd felt compelled to investigate sounds that made no sense, times when rooms felt wrong in ways he couldn't explain. Marie shared her own stories of equipment malfunctions that seemed too convenient, too precisely timed to be coincidental. I talked about the sophistication of the crying baby entity, how it had used my name and claimed knowledge about my character. Each story built on the others, creating a clearer picture of what we were dealing with. The entities weren't mindless or random. They learned from each encounter, adapted their strategies, coordinated their efforts. They understood human psychology well enough to exploit our deepest protective instincts and our need for social connection, but they hadn't counted on our ability to adapt too. As the hours passed and dawn approached, I felt something shifting in our team dynamic. We weren't just four people following rules anymore. We were becoming something more integrated, more aware of each other's needs and vulnerabilities. Tom kept checking the time as we talked, occasionally standing to look out the windows at the forest beyond. The entities had grown quiet after their coordinated assault, but we all knew they were still out there, watching and waiting and planning their next approach. Marie's radio crackled occasionally with routine check-ins from Lodge Base, confirming that the outside world continued to exist beyond our isolated reality. The helicopter would arrive in a few days with supplies and mail, but none of us talked about leaving. This work was dangerous, but we were learning to protect each other through it. The mountain wind pressed against the windows as the night wore on, carrying sounds that might have been natural wildlife or might have been something else entirely. But sitting in the warm light of the dining room, surrounded by people who understood the threats we faced, those sounds felt manageable. I thought about my grandmother's stories, how she'd emphasized that the old things in the mountains respected strength and unity more than individual bravery. The entities testing us tonight had found 4 people who'd learned to work together, to watch each other's backs, to recognize when supernatural influence was taking hold. Dawn was still hours away, but I felt confident we'd reach it together. The work was dangerous. The encounters were becoming more sophisticated, but we were learning to navigate this strange ecosystem as a team. Each night taught us something new about survival, about trust, about the delicate balance between human determination and supernatural power. The lodge settled around us as we continued our watch, and I found myself appreciating not just the safety of the dining room, but the complex relationships we'd built with each other and with the entities that called this place home. We were part of something larger now, something that required respect and caution, and the kind of teamwork that could keep us alive until the sun rose over the mountains once again. I pushed open the heavy front door, stepping onto the lodge's main porch for the first time since my shift had started nearly 12 hours ago. The cool mountain air hit my face, carrying scents of pine and damp earth that felt like a cleansing after the night's supernatural pressure. My legs were stiff from sitting in the dining room, and the wooden boards creaked under my boots as I walked to the porch railing. The forest spread out before me in every direction, mile after mile of unbroken wilderness that looked completely innocent in the early morning light. No signs of the entities that had stalked us through the darkness. No evidence of the crying baby that had tested Tom and me with such sophisticated emotional manipulation. The trees stood quiet and still, their branches heavy with morning dew, as if the supernatural encounters had been nothing more than shared nightmares. I leaned against the railing, feeling the solid wood under my palms, and let my eyes trace the ridgelines where the mountains rolled away toward the horizon. The air was thin and clean up here, sharp in my lungs in a way that reminded me I was alive and unharmed after another night of tests and challenges. My body ached with the particular exhaustion that came from staying alert for hours, from fighting supernatural influence, from maintaining constant vigilance against forces that wanted to break our rules and claim our attention. But underneath the tiredness was something else. Exhilaration, maybe. The satisfaction of survival, of making it through another shift with my team intact. The morning light painted the mountains in shades of gold and green, revealing details that darkness had hidden. Rock outcroppings jutted from forested slopes like ancient bones, and I could see the distant ribbon of a creek cutting through the valley below. This landscape had been here for thousands of years, long before the lodge was built, long before humans had tried to study and contain whatever supernatural forces called these mountains home. My grandmother's voice echoed in my memory, stories she'd told me on the porch of her cabin in eastern Kentucky when I was young enough to believe anything was possible. She'd talked about the old things that lived in the hills, entities that had been here since before recorded history. Spirits that demanded respect and acknowledgement from anyone who entered their territory. I'd grown up understanding that the mountains held power, that certain places required careful navigation and specific rules for survival. The lodge felt like a continuation of that education, a graduate course in supernatural diplomacy taught in a classroom where mistakes could be fatal. Every night brought new lessons about the entities that lived in these woods, their intelligence and coordination, their ability to exploit human psychology. I thought about the footsteps in the hallway, how close I'd come to turning around and seeing whatever had been stalking me through the familiar corridors. The whispers had been hypnotic, almost impossible to resist. And without Tom's intervention, I would have broken the fourth rule and faced consequences I couldn't imagine. The entities understood us well enough to target our weaknesses, but they hadn't counted on our ability to watch each other's backs. The front door opened behind me and Tom stepped onto the porch, his light brown hair still disheveled from running his hands through it during our long night in the dining room. He moved with the careful steps of someone who'd been sitting too long, his joints stiff and his movements deliberate. Neither of us spoke as he walked to the railing and positioned himself a few feet away, both of us looking out at the peaceful forest that had been anything but peaceful 12 hours ago. The silence between us was comfortable, built on shared experience and mutual understanding. We'd saved each other tonight, watched each other's backs when supernatural pressure had threatened to break our individual defenses. Tom had fought his own battles with the crying baby entity while I'd been tested by the footsteps in the hallway, and both of us had emerged with a deeper appreciation for the importance of teamwork in this isolated place. I could see him breathing slowly, deliberately, like he was consciously releasing the tension that had built up over the night. His shoulders were relaxed now in a way they hadn't been in the dining room, where we'd all remained alert and watchful until the first hints of dawn had appeared at the windows. Out here on the porch, with the forest visible and peaceful around us, some of the supernatural pressure seemed to lift. The mountains rolled away toward the horizon, ridge after ridge of unbroken wilderness that looked exactly as it had when my grandmother was young, when her grandmother was young, probably unchanged for generations beyond memory. This place existed outside normal time, outside the rapid changes of the modern world, a pocket of ancient power where old rules still applied and old entities still held dominion over their territory. I knew the lodge would post new rules tonight. 4 fresh index cards appearing on the dining room bulletin board with instructions tailored to whatever entity's plan to test us next. The rules changed constantly, adapting to seasonal patterns or lunar cycles or factors we hadn't learned to recognize yet. Each night brought different challenges, different supernatural personalities to navigate, different tests of our ability to follow instructions and resist temptation. The work was dangerous in ways that would probably kill us eventually. Not tonight, maybe not next week, but somewhere down the line, one of us would make a mistake or encounter something too powerful to survive. The entities were patient, intelligent, constantly learning from each interaction. They would find our weaknesses eventually, exploit some gap in our defenses or coordination that we hadn't anticipated. But standing on the porch in the morning light, feeling the mountain air fill my lungs and watching the peaceful forest stretch toward the horizon, I couldn't imagine being anywhere else. This remote outpost felt more like home than any apartment I'd rented, any job I'd worked before coming here 3 months ago. The lodge had become my calling in a way I hadn't expected, a place where my unusual background made me valuable instead of strange. Growing up with my grandmother's stories had prepared me for this work in ways that college or training programs never could have. The supernatural world she'd taught me to respect was real here, immediate and present in every shadow and sound. The entities we faced each night were the same old things she'd warned me about, the forces that demanded acknowledgement and careful navigation from anyone who entered their domain. Tom shifted beside me, checking his watch and probably calculating how many hours until our relief arrived. Corey would show up around 8 with the day shift, eager to hear about our encounters and grateful that we'd made it through another night intact. The helicopter would arrive in 3 days with supplies and mail, our only connection to the outside world that felt increasingly distant and irrelevant. Marie and the day crew would handle routine maintenance and equipment checks while we slept, preparing the lodge for whatever tests the next night would bring. The cycle would continue, night after night, as we learned to coexist with forces that most people didn't believe existed. Each shift taught us something new about survival, about teamwork, about the delicate balance between human determination and supernatural power. I had no intention of leaving when the helicopter arrived. This work was dangerous, probably fatal in the long run, but it was also the most meaningful thing I'd ever done. The lodge needed people who understood the old ways, who could navigate supernatural encounters with respect instead of fear, who could build the kind of team relationships that kept everyone alive through the darkest hours. The mountains held their ancient secrets as the morning light grew stronger, painting the forest in shades of green and gold that would fade back to shadow when evening came. But for now, in the peaceful moments between supernatural encounters, I felt grateful to be part of something larger than myself, something that connected me to the old stories my grandmother had shared and the deep power that still lived in these hills.